Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast here on October the 10th. Let's get a heat unit accumulation update. We're going to talk about what I'm seeing in my travels across the area, talk about some green stem issues in soybeans, and hear from TC Huffman, our Eastern Agronomy Manager, on some thoughts regarding fertility management going into next year. So, as far as our current heat unit accumulation, basing that on that planting date of May the 1st in the East Lansing area, we've now accumulated 2,694 heat units. Now, that's another 109 heat units gained. In comparison, we are behind only 29 heat units from last year, but we're ahead 54 heat units from the 5-year average. Now, if we're going south to Coldwater, which is, reflective of my northern Indiana, northern Ohio areas, we are now only 32 heat units behind last year, but ahead by 24 heat units versus the 5-year average there. Now, finally, if we go north to the Mount Pleasant area, we're 40 heat units behind last year, but 89 ahead of the 5-year average. Now, this week's cooler weather and spotty frost midweek should put us into a slightly more normal fall weather pattern for October. Now, as for my travels this past week, life's been heavily focused around helping with harvesting soybean plots and walking corn plots. Now, in talking to folks, it seems like there's a lot of soybean yields coming in around that mid to upper 60s and even into the 70s for bushels per acre there. And, for those folks, they're the ones that got those timely rains, but there's also a large group of folks that are seeing some more of those mid 40s to lower 50 bushel yields per acre. And, planting date, it's also played a big role in yield levels this year with I've seen actually a bump to those fields planted before the 25th of April and those planted after the 20th of May, with, of course, some exceptions along the way, again, depending on when those rains arrived. Now, as for the rain this week, we got about an inch here in mid-Michigan, but the only real value it's going to bring is going to be that germinating of the winter wheat that's been planted after the soybean harvest these past few weeks. Now, I've also had discussions with folks about green stem in soybeans this year. This is a perennial question in years like this where we go through a hot and dry weather stress late in the development of our soybean crop. Now, specifically, Ohio State recently put out a really good article on what causes green stem. Now, specifically, they stated that, quote, green stem is a disorder where the stems stay green and at times hold their leaves, while the pods have achieved their mature brown color. Crop senescence and remobilization is the movement of nutrients from the leaves and stems to the pod and the seeds. This is a source-sink relationship. So if the sinks, known as kind of the pods and seeds, are aborted in response to crop stressors, then the nutrients are not remobilized from the source, also known as the stems and the leaves. Now, when this happens, nutrients generally linger longer in the stem, causing them to stay greener longer than normal. Now, plants with this condition can be individual plants, field edges, or almost an entire field. Now, another interesting green stem situation you will see periodically in soybean fields is scattered individual green plants with nothing on them but what looks like small buds. And those are things that they wanted to become pods but didn't. Now, these plants have actually been affected by a virus in the growing season earlier, and this was kind of when those pods were developing. Now, viruses associated with these types of green stems are typically things like bean pod mottle virus and tobacco ring spot virus. Now, insects like stink bugs and bean leaf beetles both directly feed on the pods and seeds and they transmit these viruses, causing some amount of yield loss in affected fields. Although most areas this week didn't get cold enough to cause a hard freeze, when it does, this can definitely help resolve some of these green stem issues. Now, for our next topic this week, it's around a highly discussed topic lately: how to manage crop fertility this next year. Creating a balance between raising a successful crop versus managing the ever increasing cost of fertilizers is going to be a challenge. So, to help us think through this balance, I've asked our Eastern Agronomy Manager, TC Huffman, to walk us through some of the things to consider. So, TC, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks for having me on today. I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk a little bit about soil fertility and how to help customers maybe manage that in the tight economic times that we're facing. So, one of the first things I usually like to think about around fertility is Liebig's law, which is the law of the minimum, which says, whatever nutrient is needed the most or is the least available in the amount that the plant requires it creates kind of the yield limiting factor for that crop. So part of what we're doing in soil fertility is trying to limit those yield limiting factors. So we're trying to figure out what's causing us to maybe not yield to the most of our ability, and then try to take those out of the equation. So my number one thing that I always talk about, and even in times like this, that I feel like is really important, is to test your soil first and foremost. So having a good, accurate soil test is one of the key components to making good fertility decisions. So if it's time in your rotation to sample that field, then my recommendation is to continue on that rotation. Keep pulling your fertility samples. Keep making sure that you know where you're at so that you can make well-informed decisions. So the soil tests are key to understanding where the balance is out there, understanding your soils, and knowing what you can or can't afford to do. One of the first things that I like to learn or I see from a soil test is my CEC, which is your cation exchange capacity. So that's kind of the vault or the bank, and tells you how much you can hold as far as how many nutrients can you hold in that soil. So if I'm in parts of Michigan where I have very sandy soils, I might have a very low CEC, which means I can't hold a lot of nutrients, which puts me in a position where I have to manage that crop from year to year, and I have to spoon feed the crop as we go from one year to the next. If I'm in an area with a little bit more clay content, a little bit different soils, then I might get a CEC a little bit higher, which means I have some more flexibility on how I manage my fertility and what I kind of try to do. So after I look at my CEC and understand my CEC, I then look at my soil pH. So the first thing to always fix when you're looking at your fertility program is your pH. So if I'm growing corn and soybeans, I want a pH somewhere in that 6 to 7 range, with corn being closer to 6, soybeans probably being higher, closer to 7. So a lot of times we'll try to build to that 6.5 and get to a 6.5 level. And what that does is that puts me in the optimum level where my nutrients are the most available for my plant. If I'm below 6, in the mid 5s, then I have a lot of nutrients that'll be tied up that won't become available to my crop. The same thing if I'm above 7. So what I'm trying to do is keep myself in that sweet spot where the nutrients that I've applied are the most available to my plant, and then I can take them up and utilize them for growing my crop. So always look at your pH first and try to see if you can't solve for that, and make sure that that's at the optimum levels. The next thing I'll look at is my P and K to determine whether I'm in my optimum range. And if I'm in my optimum range, then I have a lot more options as far as whether I'm doing maintenance or potentially even backing off a little bit. When times are tough, sometimes we have to back off on the amount of fertility we put out there and go a year or two without applying as much fertilizer. And all of that's going to depend on what your soil tests say and are you at a critical level or not? So if you're very low in your fields, you're going to need to apply fertilizer and keep feeding that crop to make sure that it has the adequate requirements to make it to the next year. If you're very high, if you've done a lot of buildup over the years, if you've put larger amounts on and you've kind of banked your fertility over the years, then you have some more options in these lean years. The other option that you have, if you're renting some ground or you're not going to be able to test things like that, then one thing we can always do is we can always put removal back on. So corn or soybeans are going to remove a certain amount of P and K, and we can utilize that previous year's yield to determine how much P and K we need to put back on to kind of replace what the crop took off. And one of the things I really like to do, especially in tighter economic times, I like to use yield maps to then build myself a soil removal map or a fertility removal map. So you can use what you yielded across the field. And we all know that yields go up and down depending on the area of the field. And then I can kind of pinpoint the fertility that I put back on based off of the crop that I took off. And that can be an economical way to apply fertilizer, to apply back what you took off, but put it back in the spots where you needed it the most and where you yielded the most or the least. So it kind of levels out what you're applying. So that to me is a good way to do it all the time, but it's a really good way to do it in some tight economic times. Does that kind of help, Charles?
Yeah, TC, no, I really appreciate your insights on that. And, it's always a hard decision out there to make where you spend those monies for fertility. But I like your thoughts around one, making sure that we're testing so that we're really getting that focused in, and then also getting that pH right, and looking at crop removal. Huge components of that decision process. So, no, I appreciate your time and your thoughts on that. And folks, as we do wrap up this week's Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast, let's continue to get out there and walk our fields. Soybean harvest is wrapping up for many, and corn harvest has begun. Now, corn is drying faster than most of us think right now. And boy, if you haven't checked your corn lately, yeah, you too may be surprised. So let's get it out now before that next big wind or rainstorm comes in, and that really might test those stalks out there. So this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist, with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast. Be safe out there.